This is the second part of the lecture. This is a review of basic fluid homeostasis from A&P. So you remember, of course, from A&P that there's extracellular fluid and there's intracellular fluid. Intracellular fluid, of course, is in the cells. That's about 2/3 of the fluid in our body. The extracellular is in 4 compartments, and you see 2 of them here. The vascular compartment is one. That's our plasma within our blood vessels. And then what we don't see in this drawing, paralleling the vascular compartment, is the lymph system. And the lymph vessels serve to pull extra protein and fluids out of our interstitial compartment so we don't go into edema, and that they're an integral part of our immune system. And the interstitial compartment is the 3rd compartment. It is basically the fluid that surrounds the cells. And then finally we have the transcellular part of the extracellular compartment. And that's where places in the body that just need some extra sort of fluid cushion. It's a minimal amount of fluid that doesn't exchange very much with the rest of the extracellular compartment. So the cerebral spinal fluid in the brain, for example, cushioning the brain in the subarachnoid space. The pleural fluid that cushion the 2 pleura against each other. The peritoneal fluid in the heart. And the synovial fluid in your joints. Those are all examples of transcellular fluid. A small amount of fluid that doesn't exchange much with the rest of the extracellular space. So those 4 compartments of the extracellular space that we just discussed have other names that you'll sometimes see. The vascular and the lymph system, when you put that together, that's known as the 1st space. And the interstitial fluid is known as the 2nd space. The transcellular is known as the 3rd space. Now, I have to tell you, if you go into the hospital and start talking about 1st and 2nd space, no one's going to know what you're talking about. We only use those terms in books. But the 3rd space, the transcellular fluid, we do use that term 3rd space a lot because problems can arise in the 3rd space that we're going to talk about later. So the extracellular fluid is about 1/3 of our body fluid, and the intracellular fluid is the remaining 2/3. And the cations and the anions that predominate in the extracellular and intracellular fluid are different. The major cation of the extracellular space is sodium, and it's a huge player in body fluid movement because, of course, as you remember, where sodium goes, water follows. The major cations of the intracellular space are potassium and magnesium. And remember from your A&P the sodium-potassium pump on the cell, in the cell membrane. The sodium is pumped out and potassium is pumped in, so that sodium will predominate in the extracellular space and potassium will predominate in the intracellular space. And the major anions of the extracellular space are chloride and bicarbonate, and of the intracellular would be phosphate and sulfate. Let's review some basic definitions. Diffusion is the continual intermingling of molecules in liquids or gases. And the result, of course, is that this tends towards an equal spread of molecules. In our extracellular space, the primary movement is by facilitated diffusion, which is basically diffusion that's facilitated by the use of transport proteins. Osmosis, on the other hand, is the movement of water, not molecules, across cell membranes from an area of less concentrated solute to more concentrated solute. So they're trying to make everything the same concentration, essentially. And then finally we have the concepts of oncotic or osmotic pressure and hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure is the pressure of a fluid that it exerts on the walls of its container. So the hydrostatic pressure of blood is the pressure is the blood pressure, which is being pushed against the walls of the blood vessels. Osmotic pressure, on the other hand, is the pull. It's the power of a solution to draw water across a semi-permeable membrane. And the easiest way when you think about hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure is hydrostatic pressure is the push, osmotic pressure is the pull. And each of these compartments have their own push and pull. The capillaries, or the blood vessels, have their own. The interstitial fluid has its own push and its own pull. And the intracellular fluid has its own push and its own pull. And these push and pull, as we go back and forth, is one of the major components of determining fluid balance between the various compartments of the body. This picture, of course, is taken from your book. It's showing a very busy person with her fluid intake and output going on. So fluid intake, on the intake side, the major intake for our body for fluid, of course, is what we drink, any kind of fluid, anything that we're eating, because food has a large amount of fluid component to it, water in it. Any IV fluid, any irrigating solutions sometimes that we put into wounds and that kind of things. And a feeding tube, which is actually not shown here. This lady had a tube into her stomach or intestines by which we pumped solution and water. Those are all ways for there to be fluid intake into the body. There's many more ways for there to be excretion. Of course, there's urine from the kidneys. That's our major excretion of fluid in the body. Feces from the bowel, that there's a certain amount of water component to bowel movements, particularly so if someone has diarrhea. Then they're going to quite easily dehydrate. There's a huge amount of fluid loss with diarrhea. Emesis is a loss of fluid. Sweat from the skin will certainly cause a loss of fluid. Lungs can be a significant loss of fluid as well. Water vapor as we breathe out. People who hyperventilate can go into dehydration. And then if there's an abnormal situation of drains, or if there's like a wound of any kind, we can do a lot of fluid loss that way. It can be a fistula. A fistula is when there is a abnormal channel that's formed between two organs. And when that occurs, then you have fluid loss from one area of the body into the other. And then as this diagram here shows you, there's always fluid exchange going on between the three compartments, between the plasma, the interstitial, the lymph, and the intracellular. So three major factors in fluid balance in our body are antidiuretic hormone, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and atrial natriuretic factor, which I'm going to go over right now. The antidiuretic hormone being the first one. Remember, this of course is from the posterior pituitary. For this diagram, just go ahead and ignore this picture of the lungs right here. That's showing an abnormal variation, and just focus on the rest of the picture, the two organs on the right. So the key here for antidiuretic hormone, which is produced in the posterior pituitary, is serum osmolality. So if you have increased concentrated blood, let's say the blood is rather concentrated, this person's a little dehydrated. As that concentrated blood goes through the pituitary gland, it's going to cause an increased concentration of blood going through that pituitary gland causes an increase in antidiuretic hormone. The antidiuretic hormone is going to travel down to the kidneys, down to the collecting ducts, and it causes decreased diuresis because it's antidiuretic. If you have decreased diuresis, you are losing less water, so in a sense it's a water gain. And now the blood has become less concentrated. As the less concentrated blood goes back to the pituitary gland, it will now trigger less antidiuretic hormone. If you have less antidiuretic hormone, you're going to have more diuresis, and now you'll have a water loss, and the blood is now concentrated again. And that is the back and forth mechanism of antidiuretic hormone. It ends up, once again, the trigger for this is serum osmolality, and we're not talking about sodium at all in this case. It's just a gain or loss of pure water. This picture over in the lower left showing the lung cancer is just illustrating the fact that cancer can replicate this. Cancer can cause its own antidiuretic hormone, which can totally mess up the body's homeostasis. Cancer is not part of this lecture, it was just part of this slide. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, on the other hand, deals with sodium as well as water. And the trigger here is the blood volume measured by blood pressure down in the renal vasculature, down around here. If there is a decreased pressure of blood in the renal vasculature, then the juxtaglomerular apparatus is going to secrete renin. Renin goes here in the bloodstream. It's going to meet angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen is produced by the liver. Renin and angiotensinogen, when they meet, form angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 has to go to the lungs to do this, and in the lungs, angiotensin 1, if it can meet angiotensin converting enzyme, also called ACE, Those two together form angiotensin II. Now, angiotensin II is a potent vasoconstrictor, so that brings up blood pressure. It also will go down to the adrenal cortex, and in the outer zone of the adrenal cortex, it will cause the release of aldosterone. Aldosterone then goes to the distal convoluted tubules of the nephrons and causes the reabsorption of sodium. Now remember, wherever sodium goes, water follows. So if sodium is being reabsorbed, then so will water. The blood pressure will go up, so will the person's sodium level. So the net result of this is that there'll be an increased serum sodium, there'll be more water pulled into the bloodstream, hence more blood volume and a higher blood pressure. And potassium actually goes down because it exchanges with sodium if there's the positive charge. And if more sodium is being reabsorbed at the distal convoluted tubule, something has to take its place. So we end up losing potassium through the actions of aldosterone. So whereas antidiuretic hormone, it was the gain or loss of pure water, with the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, it's the gain or loss of sodium and water. And then finally we come to atrial natriuretic factor, and here the trigger is blood volume. If there's an increased blood volume, the heart will have to do some stretching. And there are receptors in the atria of the heart that, when they are stretched, produce natriuretic factor. This goes down to the kidneys, and that causes more diuresis, which will decrease the blood volume, decrease the stretch on the heart, and you'll have decreased ANF headed to the kidneys. And that is the homeostasis of that method, back and forth. Some books will call atrial natriuretic factor atrial natriuretic peptide, but it's the same thing. And that concludes part 2 of this lecture. We're going to move on to part 3, the extracellular fluid volume disorders.